Hi, I'm Claire Mitchell, QC. Welcome to the Witches of Scotland podcast. I'm a lawyer who specialises in miscarriage of justice cases, and we're bringing you this podcast because we want to tell you about the women who were accused, prosecuted, convicted, and ultimately executed as witches in Scotland.
I'm Zoe Venditozzi, and I'm a writer who's always had an interest in the witches, and I feel that this dark mark against Scotland needs a reckoning.
The campaign Witches of Scotland wants three things. Firstly, a pardon for all those convicted of witchcraft. Secondly, an apology for all those who were accused as witches. And finally, a national monument in recognition of all those who are affected by this terrible miscarriage of justice.
Over the forthcoming weeks, we'll be talking to a whole host of experts about the history and the modern day connections to the Witches of Scotland. Hello and welcome to the Witches of Scotland podcast. This will be no surprise to you, shocking to me what number we're on today. We're now on a nice sort of even sounding episode 50 of 6. So welcome to episode 50 of the Witches of Scotland podcast. We've got a great guest today. We've got Dr Ciaran Jones, who's going to be talking to us about some of the history of the properties that belong in the National Trust of Scotland, and they're linked to different witch trials. But before that, Claire, Happy New Year.
Oh, Happy New Year to you, Zoe.
Were you taken by surprise by my Happy New Year there?
Yes. I thought we were all business this morning, Zoe.
No, that was a stealth Happy New Year, because it is our first of 2022.
It is our first. Yeah.
Yeah. Good. even though on the Twitter I saw that you got your years confused.
Oh yeah, I invited everyone to think of a new podcast for 2021, which was not the best.
Yeah, but no. Also, what was not the best was that I retweeted it and totally didn't even notice that you'd put 2021. So I think you and I are both in the bin for time organisation.
Yeah, possibly. Can we shout out to Sabrina, our long-time supporter and listener, for pointing that out to us. Thanks, Sabrina.
It's helpful. Just if somebody could just get in touch with us on the daily and just remind us of what the day is and what the year is, just for a wee while. We'll get there, I think, but we're just maybe not there yet. But this is episode 50. And it's very nice to have you all with us. We've just hit 75,000 downloads, and Claire's put together a list of all the different countries that are listening or where downloads are happening.
That isn't the full list, though, that you're going to tell people about. I just got to a point where I'm like, I can't keep writing these out, but there are other ones as well.
Right, well, I'm just going to read out what you've given me because we're just going to just show off a little bit about this. So over 75,000 downloads at the time of recording. It's bound to be far higher by the time it goes out. But our listeners, our most downloadable areas are the UK and the USA, Australia and Canada. But there's also listeners in, Germany, Ireland, Denmark, New Zealand, France, Spain, Netherlands, South Africa, Switzerland, Belgium, Finland, Italy, Thailand, Norway, Sweden, Japan, Israel, Portugal, Brazil, Serbia, Austria, Laos, Romania and Greece, Qatar, Mexico, Iceland, Argentina, Hungary, Russia, Kazakhstan, Turkey, Taiwan, Singapore, Philippines, South Korea, Luxembourg, Jersey, Estonia, India, Malaysia, Iran, Nigeria, Poland, Hong Kong, Oman, Jamaica, Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Dominican Republic. That's just the ones that you managed to actually type up, Claire. So that's quite shocking.
Yeah,
and
there are
does it mean we can go on a world tour?
Absolutely. There are more. It does say audience details, geographic region, because I was reading them and thinking, we can't possibly have that many people in different countries. But apparently so. I've checked the website and that appears to be right. The ones in those last countries you named are 1% or less than 1%. So it possibly means that just one or two.
Claire, we'll take it.
We're taking it.
International audience. I'm sure there must be town halls in those places that we can book.
Two of the places that I never got to on the list were the Cayman Islands and Martinique.
Oh, Claire, we need to do a business trip.
Would it be tax deductible?
God, that'd be nice, wouldn't it? If the Tories can do it, why can't we? Anyway, let's not go down that particular route. I've got some potholes that need sorted out. Anyway. So that's one thing that's in the news, Claire. Have you got any other news that you'd like to mention?
That was seamless, Zoe. That was absolutely seamless.
As ever.
So, at the start of the year, we kicked off by being in the news. Over the Christmas and New Year period, it was so busy with folk getting in contact with us. I don't know.
Nothing says Christmas like human rights campaigns.
Well, perhaps we kicked off the new year on New Year's Day with an article in the Wall Street Journal, and I think that because that's got a really wide readership, it kind of went everywhere, and we're contacted by lots of different people. But that was a really good article, and we got lots of new American people getting in contact with us.
It was. He's a really great journalist, actually, because apart from anything else, he lives in an area that had quite a high instance of witch trials. So I think there was a really great connection there. And it was really cool, actually, having something in the Wall Street Journal, because apart from anything else, my teenage children are spectacularly unmoved by this whole situation. But my 13-year-old, I said to him, "Oh, it's in the Wall Street Journal." And actually he went, "Oh, the Wall Street Journal." And I'm not really sure why that was of such importance to him. I don't think he reads it. I don't think he has a subscription to it or anything, but strange.
When I think about the Wall Street Journal, I think about the 80s and stocks and shares.
Yeah.
It was kind of a really big newspaper when I was growing up.
It's like a real movie like newspaper.
Exactly.
In my mind. Yeah. I'm not sure that a current 13-year-old would have that background. That's quite peculiar. Maybe he does have a subscription to it. That's where he gets all his financial news from. I'm not really sure. But anyway, it was cool that it was in the Wall Street Journal. And then yesterday, we saw ourselves on screen, which for me is always kind of horrifying. But that was cool. So who was that with, Claire?
It was. We spoke to Borders ITN along with Mary Craig, who has been involved in the podcast as well. She has written the book on Borders witches. And she gave an interview about the people that were killed there. So ITN asked us to come on and speak for a little bit about the campaign. So that was good too. So we were in the news, Zoe, is what was in the news.
Quite exciting. It's very exciting. And then we've also got a couple of events that are coming up. So we're speaking at an event. Well, I say at an event, it's done remotely, isn't it? So people can attend the event from anywhere. It's one of these fantastic Zoom type occasions. So that's Linlithgow on January the 19th. And if people want to get tickets for that, we'll put a link up. We'll link to it on Twitter and stuff as well.
It's through Linlithgow Museum that is doing that. So if people want to get in contact, do that. And the other thing we're going to do, Zoe, hopefully, COVID restrictions allowing and all those sorts of things, is go and see Heel and Harrow on the 21st of January at Celtic Connections. So anyone who's wanting to see Heel and Harrow, they have done a mixed media. Is that how you would describe it? Mixed media?
Quite possibly. Yes, maybe. Yeah.
They've got the written word of Mary Kidd, who was one of the first people to speak to us, and they have put music to the stories of a number of inverted commas witches from history. So sometimes they've taken stories of the women, and sometimes they've taken the stories of the confessions and turned them into both music and written word. So really looking forward to that.
And if you can't make the Glasgow one on the 21st, we said before, but there's a really quite a big list of places on their tour all over the place. So you should be able to catch them hopefully somewhere near you. And if you have a look for Heel and Harrow on Twitter, for example, you'll find them there and you'll get the tour dates. So that's quite exciting. That's some stuff to look forward to, which is always good for the early days of January to have some stuff in the diary. So Claire, as we are inclined to do each episode, do you have a list of women and possibly some men who were accused of witchcraft?
I do. As we'll come to hear, Dr Ciaran Jones is looking specifically now at the allegations of witchcraft in Queensferry. And I thought what we could do is read out a list of the people that were involved in witchcraft accusations in Queensferry. So most of these accusations took place in either 1644 or 1649. There are a few other dates, but most of them are those dates. And I thought what I'd do is just read out the list of the names of those people so that we remember them today as folk and not as witches. Their names are Margaret Barton, Isabel Bathgate, Margaret Brown, Elspeth Cant, Janet Cant, Christian Cuthbertson, Marion Dolleen, Margaret Dolleen, Elspeth Grinlaw, Helen Hill, Agnes Lawson, Marion Little, Catherine Logie, Janet Lowry, Janet Mowbray, Marion Steen, Janet Stephen, Christian Syme, Catherine Thompson, Helen Thompson, Isabel Young and Margaret Young. We remember all these people as men and women and not as witches.
So many people in that list. It's just terrible when you just keep coming back to thinking about it.
For such a small place as Queensferry.
Yeah.
And Queensferry's tiny now, but you imagine it when the size of the whole of Scotland was less than 1 million. It's quite astounding.
It's something that actually came up. There was a bit of chat about this last night after the news piece on ITN was aired about what happened in the borders. And there was some footage of Mary Craig, the historian, standing talking about a particular area, Stowe, in the borders. And just thinking about what it looks like now, it's like, you know, it's pretty spread out and it's quite isolated, and what it must have been like to live in these small communities when this was happening. Very frightening indeed to put yourself in their shoes. But thanks very much, Claire. So guest today is Dr. Ciaran Jones, and he's a historian of religion and witchcraft in early modern Scotland, and he recently completed his PhD in Scottish history at the University of Edinburgh in 2020. His thesis explored the relationship between Calvinism and witchcraft trials, and it focused on the religious and spiritual aspects of some accused witches' confessions. Ciaran's research has been published in History Scotland magazine, the Scottish History Society, and a chapter of his thesis is due to appear in the next volume of the Journal of Magic, Ritual and Witchcraft, which is published by the University of Pennsylvania. So without any further ado, please welcome to the podcast, Dr. Ciaran Jones.
Hi Zoe, hi Claire, good to see you.
It's great to have you here. We actually met you in real life, which is very, very unusual on the podcast because a lot of these interviews are just done via Zoom and we never actually meet the person. We had the lovely opportunity to meet you back in 2021, the other year there. And I think it would be helpful, first of all, Ciaran, if you would tell people what it was that brought us to meet you, because I think that it's such a fascinating thing. Can you share that?
Yeah, I can share that. So probably around May last year, 2021, I was contacted by the National Trust for Scotland, and they commissioned me to do some research into their properties, looking at the connections between their properties and the Scottish witchcraft trials. And the project at the time was just to basically draw up an internal report that put forward these connections in some of their properties. And that means the names of the locations, any sort of stories or narratives that were associated with these properties about witchcraft. Because, you know, there was perhaps some misinformation in one of their membership magazines that perhaps could have been better researched. The National Trust felt that the time was right to do some more deeper research into their properties. So when they put out, public information, that it's quite accurate and sensitive about the witch trials and this particular topic. And then I think that coincided with your campaign and your podcast, which by that point you've been running for about over a year. I think by May of last year, you were quite well known and you had quite a lot of listeners around the world. So I think that's how we crossed paths. And then we met at a local conference that the National Trust had organised in Kirkcaldy back in the summer when the weather was much nicer than it is now. And that was where I just presented a small presentation on the report that I had done for them. And yeah, that's how we met.
And was that your area of interest, Ciaran, before the National Trust approached you and asked you to do this piece of work as well?
I got interested in this topic by chance, really. I studied history at school, and a lot of it had been quite modern history, looking at Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia, or looking at, British prime ministers, which I think still is to this day some of the standard history curriculums. And so when I got to university and studied history as an undergraduate, I was, not surprised, but I was excited by the fact that, I had now the chance to study, a more broader selection of historical periods. And there was this one course being offered, I think it was called State Formation and the Law in Early Modern Europe. And I thought, well, I'd never done any early modern history. And early modern history is, the period from about roughly 1500 to 1800. And lots of things took place, lots of wars, lots of technological, economic and societal changes took place in that time. And I thought, okay, I'll give it a go. But then there were a couple of topics on that course to do with witchcraft. And so I really got interested in the relationship between witchcraft and the law, and the fact that, these early modern kingdoms and early modern territories passed laws against something called witchcraft, and they took it very seriously. And before that, I just heard about witchcraft through TV shows and saw it as some sort of superstitious thing. So yeah, very much interested in witchcraft and the law. But the university I went to, we only had one early modern lecturer, and they were German, so I ended up looking at a lot of German witchcraft history and some English witchcraft history. My original ambition was to become a history school teacher, but I thought I loved this research side of things so much, I want to take it further. So I went on to do postgraduate work, to do a master's. And I thought, well, I don't speak German, and I could take some time out to learn German, but I didn't know how long that was going to take me, and whether this would just be a fleeting interest, and by the time I'd learned German, I would have lost interest in pursuing history as further. So I thought, I'd done a lot on England, but I knew about Scotland. It was in some of the core academic edited books, where you can read all about witchcraft. And Scotland always featured, either in footnotes or in chapters of books. I thought, I'll give it a go. And then I came up to Edinburgh, and that's how I got onto witchcraft in Scotland and became more fascinated actually with Scottish history and religion. So that's how I got onto this topic.
I didn't realise that you had the sort of the legal background interest as well, which I'm sure will be of interest to Claire. It is really fascinating. And I think one of the things that I want to talk to you a little bit about today is the myth busting, which you've kind of alluded to already. The idea you had going into study the background of the witch trials was kind of an idea from TV and film, which I think we've talked about a lot on the podcast, is that our sort of cultural ideas of what witchcraft and what the witch trials were and what happened, in fact, people that were accused, are really very much informed by TV programs and by films, which is a really bizarre kind of a loop of often complete nonsense. And I'm wondering, when you first started studying it, was there anything that still stays in your mind that you thought, oh wow, that didn't happen like that?
Yeah, I think the most one that struck me quite a lot was that most of the people that were accused considered themselves to be Christian or identified as Christians, whereas in a lot of TV shows that I had watched, their own personal faith isn't really discussed at all, or they have some sort of connection to some modern pagan sort of nature god. If religion is entirely absent, then the sort of the theme of faith or power is filled by sort of, feminism or something like that. So I was quite interested when I came to studying those people that were accused. I wasn't expecting to see, these very powerful young women that you've seen like Charmed or Buffy the Vampire Slayer or other sort of, teenage pop dramas, but actually sort of, middle-aged women who identified strongly as Christian. That stuck with me and still does to this day.
It's so interesting, isn't it, that the idea that there were these women hundreds of years ago who were as far from empowered as you can possibly imagine, and as Christian as you can possibly imagine, that through time, first of all, the people became a figure of fun, and then they became icons, I suppose, for feminism, strong, powerful women. It's really, really strange that turn, and it's really not surprising as a result of that. A lot of people have got really the wrong idea about witchcraft. I mean, it's perfectly understandable that people have that issue.
Yeah, and I think that's, you see it even in quite well-known tabloid articles today about some of these myths being regurgitated. I think that's because, where people get their information from, is the internet. People don't readily go into their local library and pick up a history book on witchcraft, or they don't, order one from Amazon or wherever they can get it from their university library, because it's just more convenient to do a Google search and see what they can find on the internet. So I think that's sometimes why these things persist.
Yeah, I think we spoke to Owen Jones about that, and his sort of howling into the abyss of trying to tell people things about witchcraft. Is just trying to fight the internet with information. And, he gets up every day and still does it, and so do you. So thanks very much. Thanks very much for that.
You're welcome.
When you started to do the research for the National Trust, is that they've got a lot of properties. So how did you narrow in on particular areas or particular buildings?
It was really useful for me to get a list of their properties. I think they have just over 100 or just under, I can't remember off the top of my head now. I think it's just over 100 properties. And what was really helpful to begin with to try and narrow down which properties had some sort of connection, whether it be a direct connection with the property, and that means sort of, either, an accused witch, had been executed, for example, or accused in the immediate vicinity of where that property is, or perhaps the landed family who used to own that property, whether they were involved in witchcraft prosecution. So I called that a direct connection, or sort of a peripheral connection would be, well, a connection, there's no direct connection with the property, but perhaps there was a witch trial that took place, a few miles down the road, or an accused witch lived in a nearby town or village. So in order to sort of get a sense of those connections, I used the University of Edinburgh's recent map, the witches.is map, which basically took a lot of the data from the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft database, which was done in 2003 by Julian Goodare, Louise Yeoman, and Joyce Miller and Lauren Martin. Took all that data and basically visualized it on this online interactive map, which made it incredibly easy and useful to look at the spatial connections. And that really allowed me to narrow down the properties that potentially had connections.
And how many properties did you find that had connections out of that 100?
About 39 properties.
That's so a lot. Actually, I'm surprised it's that many.
Yeah, quite a few. I can't remember off the top of my head the split between what I call direct and peripheral, but there would be some sort of connection. Usually the most common was that the historical owners, that the historical families who used to own these properties were either involved in the prosecution. That was probably the biggest connection that I found, particularly in sort of the building properties.
So is that the buildings that were owned by people who had wealth and status and power and influence were the people who were the commissioners of investigation? I think they called commissioners in the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft. So it's mostly the connection with them that's recorded rather than the people themselves that were accused to be witches. Is that right?
Yeah, there's more evidence, I think, of the wealthy and those with status, because they were the ones that left behind. They were more like the ones to leave behind a trail of evidence. They were the ones that were likely to be able to write and record their own, diaries or records, or their name is more likely to appear in the type of evidence that survives, which are the commissions. That's the most common form of evidence that survives, that allows us to track these witch trials that took place in Scotland. And because of the nature of the commissions, the wealthy men who sat on these commissions, their name is on them. Although I would say, even though the report doesn't have as much detail as most people would like about those who are accused, at least their names are recorded in the report. So I try to track as far as possible if certain accused witches were accused nearby or executed, that I recorded their names and recorded as much as I could about them.
I think that's the best that we can do, really, isn't it? I mean, there isn't that sort of depth of information that you would like to have. I think that now people are so used to being able to, obviously not proper academic researchers, you don't do this, but the sort of your lay researchers are so used to being able to just look stuff up on the internet. It's frustrating that actually there is a dead end. It could just be a name. And we have, every week when we do the podcast, we give a list of different people that were accused and try and tell as much of their stories as we possibly can. But, Claire, when she does the research and finds the information, often it is just somebody's name and it says, executed, and there might be a date, there might be a little bit more information, but often it's really scant, which is why we're going to be doing an episode hopefully quite soon where we look at how people research their background, because when we've been interviewed by various newspapers who've said, can you please put us in touch with a direct descendant of somebody that was executed, we always kind of go, well, no, not really, because the records just don't exist. And I think that it's really interesting what you've said there about it's the people that had the money and the power that are recorded, and they often were the accusers or were involved in the sort of the court side of things. So we've got one woman who got in touch with us from America who's discovered that she is, and this is proven, that she's descended from one of the accusers, and we're going to have her on. But that was easy to prove, or easier to prove, because it had been recorded, because they had money, and like you say, they could write and they had property, and you could follow it all down that way. But for sort of ordinary people, the accused and the executed, there, and we've talked before as well about the names that are repeated over and over again in Scotland. There are lots and lots and lots of, as you've said yourself, Janets, in different permutations. Names weren't necessarily spelled consistently or correctly because, people couldn't write. So it's a really fascinating area when people say, oh, I'm descended from this person that was burnt at the stake. And we have to say, well, that wasn't a thing in Scotland. Then they tell us that they're related. And I'm always curious about where their rigorous research is and how they would prove that line backwards. So I'll be interested to speak to genealogists at some point to see what they can do. But it's amazing though that you've been able to have a look at these different properties, and you've listed the names where you can, and you've looked at the connections, because it makes history so much more real, doesn't it? For non-historians to go to one of these properties and say, oh, now I can look at this research and I know that this person was linked to here. It's fascinating. It's really interesting work that you've done.
Yeah. I think there can be ways to develop it further. So I don't know what the National Trust is planning to do with the report, but I think we discussed at the conference back in the summer of the various sort of ways you could visualize the data online, a bit like what Edinburgh University have done with the map, and perhaps, put out this data on some sort of online map so people can actually tangibly look at the map and make the connections, which perhaps makes it a bit more easier to look at than just reading a report. I think it's going to be helpful for the NTS staff at local properties, who interact with the public, who may up till now perhaps not have had good, well-researched information, and now they can refer to this report. And when they speak to visitors and members of the public who come to specific properties where I've identified connections, perhaps they'll be a bit more confident to be able to just talk about this topic with visitors, which also helps the visitors as well, because then, they get some good information while actually visiting the property itself.
It's fantastic work that you're doing, and particularly delighted that people, as you say, will be able to go and find out about these things. I think one of my first questions when we came and spoke to you is the information going to be publicly available? Are you going to be able to show us it? And I really, really hope that that's the way the NTS decide to go forward.
It's good that you mentioned that, because I looked at just a couple of days ago, and the report actually has been made available to view publicly, and it's been updated, and the NTS have put some nice cover pages on and perhaps improved upon a lot of my writing. But yeah, if you type in on just Google NTS witchcraft history or NTS research, you can download the project report as a PDF, and it has a contents page, and so they've obviously made it available publicly.
Oh, that's brilliant, because we had such a good day. We were at Curis, which of course is a very, very important in terms of witchcraft history in Scotland, being nearby to Torryburn, the place where Lilith AD's grave, put the word grave in inverted commas, not great when you're on a podcast, is. It was such a fascinating day. I can tell the listeners that it was not only one of the sunniest, most beautiful days of the year, but we were in a room with, no windows. I'm only imagining it was no windows. It did have windows. So interesting was the chat that we ended up having. There was yourself, Professor Goodair was there, members of the NTS were there, and we had such a good chat that well past finishing time, when we all should have gone, we were still there an extra 45 minutes, weren't we? Just chatting about, I suppose, the discourse of witchcraft in the modern day, when usually any conference I've been to on law, as soon as it's like quarter to the time that something's supposed to finish, everyone's like, finish up now, please. So I'm so delighted that information is going to be made available for everybody.
It was a really great response from the National Trust, because I remember when this first kind of happened, somebody had brought it to, this sounds like we're in charge, somebody had brought it to our attention that the National Trust had these kind of sort of they were kind of inappropriate, the way that it was written in the newsletter. It was a bit too jovial. And we were quite near the beginning, I think, of the campaign, and there were a few people that got in touch and said, oh, have you seen this? And we got in touch with the National Trust, and they were really, really responsive very quickly and sort of said, oh, you're right, we've got the tone wrong with that one, we're going to look into that. And we were so heartened by the fact that they took it seriously, and then they got you on board, and that you've been able to then clarify and expand what the knowledge is that's there, because really that's what we're looking for at the end of the day, is for there to be clarity and for people to understand the history and not to make stuff up or to go about with these kind of wrong-headed, Hollywoodized ideas about what's going on. There was an article that came out a few days ago in, I think, The Guardian, that was about reclaiming the idea of witches, and it was from quite what I would describe as a kind of a neo-pagan lens of looking at it and using phrases like the burning times and the witch wound and stuff like that. What do you think of people kind of reclaiming the history of witch trials in those terms?
Yeah, I don't necessarily have a problem with it, as long as, I say, the history is being talked about correctly. So, if it's about claiming sort of empowerment or getting some positivity, healing some trauma, making modern day comparisons, I think that is needed. I think, and it's quite innovative type of thinking, and obviously for people's sense of personal identity and their own livelihoods, they find some meaning in it. But as long as the history is being, I say, talked about correctly, but as we see in these types of articles, far too often the history is unfortunately not being talked about correctly, or is not really being researched that well.
Well, I think one of the biggest areas that Claire and I think have both been told repeatedly by different academics and researchers is that in these times, people absolutely were Christian. They were all Christian, and they'd be horrified to have this accusation of being a witch or of, being in league with the devil thrown at them, because they genuinely believed in the devil and the idea of that kind of evil and so on. And they genuinely believed themselves to be Christians.
Yeah, and I think what you find with some of these modern groups that like to talk about reclaiming the witches, or looking to take some positives away from what happened, is that they do tend to either intentionally or unintentionally put forward the idea that witches who were accused and executed in the witch trials were also pagan, or were sort of descended from these people who were executed, which is not true. They did consider themselves to be Christian. People in the early modern period wouldn't view witchcraft as a positive force. It was something to be feared and reckoned with. The idea of witchcraft was specifically about harmful magic. It wasn't about practicing good magic, which is what a lot of modern groups, particularly modern pagans, view witchcraft today. To them, witchcraft is about positivity, goodness, practicing spells. It's not about harmful magic. And I think that distinction between historical witchcraft and modern day witchcraft gets lost in some of these quite emotive and quite altruistic, claims of reclaiming the witch trials, or, finding them quite liberating for modern people today.
Yeah, I think that's true. You don't want to rain on anyone's parade that's finding positives to take from these things. We just keep having to come back to the historical fact. And I think one of our earliest podcasts we had on Professor Goodyear, who the poor man spoke to us, I think, for about 5 hours altogether. And we have 3 podcasts right at the very start with him. And he goes into some length about the start of that in the 1930s and the growing pagan community, and how the sort of 2 stories became intertwined. And I think it's part of his life's work as well to kind of ensure that they remain unentwined as far as anyone speaking to him about it. Can you tell us, when you were looking at your researches, was there any stories in particular or any building in particular that struck you that had a particular resonance or interest for you when you were doing it? Perhaps any building that you thought, how bizarre, I wouldn't have thought there'd been witchcraft links there.
I think one of the properties that stuck with me was Gladstone's land, which I think sparked off a lot of this project, generating the report and what have you, is as Gladstone's land, which is in itself is a fairly obvious 17th century building from looking at it and its history. But
can I just say for listeners, because we've got listeners worldwide, Gladstone's land's one of the oldest buildings in Edinburgh, which still exists in the form that it was in hundreds of years ago. And up till recently, what they did was on each floor, they went through a different century, putting in the furniture of the time. So that the first century was basically pretty much like a sty. It would show you where the animals stayed and where you stayed. And then the next floor, it was more sophisticated, and then the floor above it. But it's all changed now, 21st century. It's got an ice cream parlour at the bottom of it, and it's got different floors going up. And one of the floors has got rooms in it that people can stay in. And one of those rooms is named after a local minister, and that's Struthers. Is that right?
Yeah, William Struthers. He was an Episcopalian bishop in the 1630s, and he was involved in the case of Marion Muir, who was an accused witch from around the Leith area in early 1630s. And what struck me about, even though William Struthers himself didn't really have a major role in her trial, it was interesting that through looking through him and his connections, I learned a bit more about Marion Muir and what she had to go through. And her trial was pretty rigorous. She had a few interrogations, which were quite standard. But she was also examined by a doctor, a physician of the day, who also came to the conclusion perhaps that she may have not been in the right mind, that perhaps something was ailing her that wasn't to do with witchcraft, but he wasn't very vocal about it to the Privy Council, who was the ultimate authority on deciding witchcraft trials. So that was quite interesting to get that sort of medical perspective, a doctor being brought in, because you don't usually see that in witchcraft trials. It happens occasionally in the late 1600s. There's a famous example of Christine Shaw of Bargaran, surrounding the Paisley witch trials and the cases of her demonic possession. And a doctor is called in to examine her. So there's that case, but it's very, very rarely that you find evidence of doctors being called in. So that stuck with me. I didn't expect, as a witchcraft historian, I had kind of some expectations of what I was going to find. But when I looked at Gladstone's Land, and William Struthers, who's an Episcopalian bishop and who was involved in the interrogation, I didn't think that would lead me to an interrogation where a doctor was called in to testify.
And that's such a shame that the doctor did speak about mental abilities and made that comment, because, of course, we know that Marion was executed as a witch, isn't that right?
Yeah, she was. It's quite interesting because he had prescribed her some sort of medication, but according to the doctor's testimony, Marion was quite stubborn and just refused to go back and see him. And so that's why he wasn't quite vocal in defending her, because he thought that she was perhaps being a bit stubborn, which is why the Privy Council again decided to try her as a witch.
It's unbelievable. If you just think there's a woman, she's in Leith, she's called a witch, she's not a witch. And then in order to test whether or not she's a witch, I suppose, part of the evidence against her is finding out whether or not she is well enough mentally. And when she says, I don't need any of your medication, well, maybe because she wasn't a witch, that was something that didn't assist her in her case. We just never know what the actuality of why she refused that, but it's just so sad to hear. But at least now we know much more about Marion, and I think the National Trust, whilst the name of the room is still after Struthers, have made great efforts to tell the story of Marion so that people going there know the history of that woman as well. So I think that's really important that her name is given some recognition. I think that's really important. If we are going to talk about witchcraft trials and talk about the people that were involved in the interrogations, at the very least we ought to highlight, if we know them, the names of the people that suffered as a result of the miscarriage of justice.
It's kind of an unpalatable thing for us now, because I think there's such a move to say, well, somebody did a bad thing or they were involved in a bad thing, so they must be kind of stricken from the records. I think that's really interesting, because Struthers, it's been said, and you mentioned there, Ciaran, he didn't actually play a very big part in it. It's not that he wasn't some guy that was kind of the driving force and was like, I denounce all these women and quickly strangle them. It wasn't sort of that side of things. And I think that that's something that the National Trust had said to us at the time was, well, he wasn't really that involved, but I think it's important that we do the research with history, or that somebody, you know, reputable like you, Ciaran, does the research, and then can tell us actually the complex and difficult facts of being human at any time in history. You know, people often did what we would look back and say, well, that was a terrible thing, and so it was, but it was a big and complex societal issue. You know, it wasn't just a case of the simplified version that we sometimes hear now, which is that men got together and went, right, we hate women, let's kill lots of them. It wasn't as straightforward as that. It was a much more complex kind of legal background that obviously we've spoken about before, and it was something that wasn't something used by the state, and that was, everybody bought into it. It was a whole societal belief system. So I think it's really fascinating to humanize that as well, and to see people's real stories about what happened there as much as we possibly can.
Ciaran, right on that point that Zoe makes, I think I saw you tweeting and it was so interesting. You said it's not helpful to call these things panics because they weren't panics, they were the opposite of panics.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, quite a few historians disagree about what terms should be used: panics, witch hunts, witch trials.
Satanic rhymes with panic. That's really it, isn't it? Sorry.
You know, historians disagree, but I think you've got some historians, like you had Professor Goodair on quite early on, who was also my supervisor, and he would be someone who would use the word panic to describe, you know, these quite large witch hunts that you know, where it's a sort of a chain reaction where multiple suspects are interrogated and name others, and it sort of snowballs out of control. He would use the word panic to describe those types of witch trials, but I would probably use the word witch hunt rather than panic, because even though tragically multiple people were accused and executed and people were naming each other, there was still some sort of legal process that was followed, even in such a decentralized legal system as Scotland as it was in the 1600s. There were still some checks and balances that needed to be in place, and which is ultimately why we have these records, because there needed to be some accountability. And we have that in the form of the depositions, the confessions, in some cases the trial records or processes of what was going on. And, you know, also some of the people, you know, involved in doing the prosecution, you know, they weren't sort of running around with their hands up, flaring around, not knowing what they were doing. You know, even if they weren't trained in the law, they were knowledgeable about their communities or perhaps, you know, on spiritual matters. So I tend to use the term witch hunt, particularly if you can tell if it's also being directed at certain people, whereas the word, I think, panic, to sort of the general reader, it gives the impression that these things were sort of out of control. There were no sort of due process. They were being run by people who didn't know what they're doing, which is not the case in Scotland or any other sort of European state that pursued witch trials.
Which I think is why it's so fascinating that some people's response to us asking for a pardon, and this has come up a little bit recently, is people saying, well, they don't need a pardon. Why are you pardoning them? That shows that they've done something wrong, and that, you know, that they're, you know, and Claire's had to explain a few times what it really means legally. I think it's important that we recognize that this was something that was done legally and correctly, you know, if we can use that word. It was following generally a proper, organized and socially agreed structure, you know, that we now find obviously distasteful. But that's one of the reasons we're looking for a pardon, is because it wasn't just somebody randomly just grabbing people and accusing them. It was a very organized and orderly time in that respect.
Yeah. And I think, you know, that's one of the reasons why your campaign is so good, is because, you know, you're seeking the pardon, and I think it's the apology and the national memorial monument to be set up, and you're putting forward these cases really well. I think you had Owen Davies on recently, who said about, you know, whatever people's views on pardons are, or what have you, you know, the education value that these have, the amount of people who think more deeply about this topic and perhaps won't go to, you know, Google quickly. They'll think, well, I heard this speaker on this podcast, they recommended this book, or, you know, that's maybe more interested in digging a bit deeper about this topic. I think the educational benefits really outweigh all sort of the negatives you get about people's personal opinions on pardons and monuments and what have you.
Because it's something that I will admit, I was insomniac last night, and I engaged a little bit on Facebook with somebody after the, sorry, Claire, after the Guardian comments about the article came out. I know, I'm sorry, it was Americans, it's the time zone. There was some crazy ideas. I was very polite though, and just said, oh, we're asking for a pardon and apology. And there were a couple of people that said, oh, what's the point? What's the point? But they've been dead for hundreds of years. And it's the same thing that we come back to all the time, particularly for me as a teacher. It's about education. It's about, as you're saying there, saying to people, well, think a little bit more about it. Think about what happened and why some of these things occurred. Think about who you are now and who we are now as humans, and what we can learn from the past. I don't think that there's any reason to say, well, it was 300 years ago and therefore let's just forget about it. I don't agree with that at all. I think the more we know about our past, the better we can be as humans now, which maybe sounds a bit hippie-ish.
Can I say that my favourite response so far of all the responses has been someone who set out a long diatribe in block capitals, shouting in block capitals as to why we weren't doing enough. Like we ourselves. And I was like, well, I'm sorry, but if you want to start a campaign which goes far and beyond what we're doing, we're totally there for you. We'll be listening to you. We'll be delighted.
The person that I was talking to in the middle of the night last night said to me, it's pointless looking at an apology for 300 years ago and a pardon for 300 years ago. Why don't you sort things out for women now? I was like, dude, if you know how to sort things out for women now, please share with me the golden rules, and I will keep working away at that as well. But I can't fix everything. But this is one thing that we can say, like bring it out into the light and talk about it, and it hopefully would have a positive impact on today.
So it's not surprising you can't get any sleep if you're up in the middle of the night thinking, how can I solve all the problems for women?
And I haven't worked out a solution, Claire.
To just quickly talk about, people who say, well, can't you do more? I think, until very recently, it was something that, was considered to be a niche academic subject. Well, it's not anymore. And people are engaging with the history, not just people who have done PhDs or done degrees, just every, general readers, members of the public who want to know more about this topic. So, yeah, I think you're doing quite a lot.
I wasn't fishing for compliment. That's very, very kind.
I'll take the compliment.
We'll take it.
Because we really didn't at all intend for this to sort of go on for as long as it has. I mean, we knew it would take time to get a pardon and apology. We knew that. But when we started the podcast, we keep saying this, we only intended to do 6 episodes. And you're episode 50, Ciaran. So, there's so much information, but people are so fascinated with it. We're fascinated with it. It's just an amazingly interesting topic. So I don't know why anybody wouldn't want to know about something that's interesting.
We should make clear that we certainly weren't the first to talk about having a national monument or indeed a pardon. There have been people long before us, including Julian. I think I saw articles over 10 years ago where Julian was calling for a national memorial. But what was absent then, I suppose, was the framework around which we've talked about it, because despite the fact that he was earnestly talking about it as an academic, talking about why it would be good to have a national memorial, it was still being talked about as, haha, witches, here's the fun, here's spooky things. And it's still happening to us. We've sometimes got really great articles. We had really recently an article, in fact, January the 1st, the Wall Street Journal published an article about it, and we're like, great, and they took it seriously. But then there was still a picture of, at least it was 3 witches from Macbeth. It was taken from a historical thing. But the pictures that are being put along with these, still there's a disconnect between the reality of history and what a terrible thing happened to people and how we show these. So I think really what's happened is that over time, views have changed about how we view these people, and it gives more weight to the argument that we should properly memorialise what's happened. So yeah, just want to give a shout out to Julian, who at least a decade or so was saying, could we have a national memorial? Ciaran, you told me in discussions that you are doing more witchcraft investigations, in particular in Queensferry. Is that right?
Yeah, I am slowly in my own time, because I don't have an academic career, so I work on this project, whenever I can. So I was really interested in looking. There's been lots of work on, Scottish witchcraft for decades, starting with, Christina Lana in the 1980s, and it's progressed very nicely till now. And we've got far newer studies, and we understand a bit more about the dynamics of witch hunting, where it took place, when witchcraft cases stopped and when they ended, how much belief persisted for, until and when after the trials stopped. So we have lots of studies of the dynamics of witch hunting and witch trials at a regional level, perhaps even, across multiple counties and territories across particularly lowland Scotland, but there's been some work on the Highlands too. But I still think we don't understand some of the actual dynamics of individual trials. What happened when in a witch trial in a particular parish? What was the relationship like between the prosecuting authorities there, or perhaps the more wealthy community members and those who were accused? We still need to understand these local dynamics more. So I really became interested in Queensferry really out of chance, because the witch hunt at Queensferry took place in the 1640s, which is a time when the Covenanters are in power, this radical religious group that sees control of a lot of political and ecclesiastical institutions across Scotland, and they're putting forward, their own vision of a godly Scotland. And one of the aims of these Covenanters and sections of higher Scottish society is to crack down on witches, which they think are on the increase. And this makes sense because the 1640s is at a time of war, of famine, of plague, and coupled with this this quite zealous radical religious vision. So the witch hunt at Queensferry happens among all these different things that are going on. And it's really spearheaded by a deeply committed Covenanter called Ephraim Melville, who's the grandson of James Melville, a famous Presbyterian from the late 16th, early 17th century. And, we still don't understand a lot about the minister's role in particular witch trials and the local dynamics. So I'm looking at, how Melville sort of control and spearheaded the prosecution and his role in it, because the general consensus is that witch trials that took place in the local communities, the initial accusations were either put forward to the Kirk Session, which was the local church court, or the Kirk Session took the initiative to investigate rumours. And there's been lots of work on the corporate nature of the Kirk Session as a whole, which was made up of the local minister and elders, which are prominent members of the community. But the minister as an individual hasn't really been looked at in much more detail. And I wanted to understand what was going on at Queensferry in 1643. How did the witch hunt develop? So that's really what I'm doing. And I'm going to see also if there's any connections between other witch trials that happened during that time, because it takes place, to say, in 1643 to 1644, and that's been identified as sort of a small peak in witch hunting. There was a big peak in 1649 to 50. There's been a lot of scholarly work done on that peak, but 1643 to 1644 hasn't really been studied before. So I'm wondering if any of my research into Queensferry and what happened there will perhaps develop further, looking at other witch trials more regionally as well.
And how do you go about researching things like that? Where, for somebody that's not a historic researcher, how do you actually find that information?
I mean, if you're not a trained historian and can't read the manuscript records, you can get some of your information from the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft database. It doesn't give you that much, but you can look at the names of people involved in the trials, and it will give you maybe 1 or 2 sentence information about what happened. Occasionally, you can find in 19th century printed publications, you can find copies of trial records that have been transcribed. Usually it's just the commission, again, which will give you some more information about perhaps who was being tried. It will, of course, give you the name of the commissioners who sat on the trials. It can be a mixed bag, because there are some commissions where the interrogation process has been transcribed and copied out. And so you actually get quite a bit of information of the confessions and what the witches said what the accused witches said under interrogation and torture. But most often it's just the name of the commissioners and the short sentence saying that a trial is being held on this date, for example. Yeah, so it's usually in these 19th century printed antiquarian publications of these, people in the 19th century who had read the manuscripts and transcribed them themselves. So other people can look at the trial records that way.
Do you go back and look at the manuscripts?
Oh, me, yes.
And then you're
Yeah.
poring over everything. And I've seen little snippets of things that people have sometimes shared on Twitter saying, look, what does this actually say? Can anybody else give me your best guess? How on earth do you get to understand what that writing actually says?
I think it's just training. There are far more people historians, but who also not historians, who can read, handwriting from the 1600s much better than I can. But I went into, I think it was an intensive sort of 6-week paleography course at the National Records of Scotland. I think it was once a week, every Tuesday, from September till January or something like that, September to December. And it was a hands-on class. So you would go in and they would give you, photocopies of the records, and you would sit, and every week you would go through the records. So actually just, looking at the records, a lot of it's trial and error as well. So if we, to work out a certain word, if you can recognize some of the letters, but you're stuck on getting some of them, you can kind of just try and make a good guess and see if it fits the context of the sentence. But yeah, it's about learning the letters and how they were written and what some of the abbreviations mean and things like that. But of course, with these type of documents, the spelling and things like that weren't standardized. So punctuation, forget about it. Spelling of certain words, you could be reading a paragraph and the same word pops up a few times and it's spelled differently each time. And it could be it could be someone's name, or it could be, another word. You can learn it in 6 weeks if you put your mind to it.
Need to get a crack team of English secondary teachers in. That sounds like marking that I would have done in the past, where you're like, whoa, this is a very eccentric approach to the spelling of these words. It's quite often. But I don't know how you do it, though. It must absolutely do your head in, sitting looking at these really tiny, I imagine it to be really tiny, sort of impenetrable scribbles in certain ways.
It does take a while, and you could be spending hours on, the same paragraph, or even sometimes the same sentences, trying to work out the exact meaning of the words. I find it exhilarating when you do crack it, and you've read this document and you've got some new information. I really enjoy the archival work, the primary research, more than actually writing the actual eventual whatever it becomes, a publication of some sort. A lot of these are accessible online as well.
Is it Our Scotland that now has something?
Scotland's People, I think it's called.
Scotland's People that now has these online, because I clicked on myself. My instinct is to go, oh, I would really, really love to do that. And then, as Zoe says, you click on it and you go, nah, I think I'll leave that to the professionals.
But so the church court records, these Kirk session records that I mentioned, that's mainly what I'm using at the moment to look at Queensferry, the Queensferry witch hunt, because that's really only what survived. So these records are usually, they're not the trial records, they're information before the trial has been granted. So this is the Kirk session collecting as much evidence as it can, whether that be in the form of, confessions or just documenting the general process of what's happening. Like on such and such day, this accused witch was taken and imprisoned. A month later, this happened. So you can get a general sense of what was going on. So that's the record I'm using. And they're the ones that you can access on the Scotland People's website. You don't actually have to go into the National Records of Scotland anymore and sit on one of their computers and read it digitally. You can sit from home and access them for free.
Well, Ciaran, I think we definitely will want you to come back on again and speak about your researches in Queensferry, if that's at all possible. But can you tell us just now, give us a small glimpse into the story of Queensferry? I know that you're at an early stage, but just maybe approximately how many people were involved in it, or anything that you can give us, any tidbits you can give us just now?
Yeah, so as I said, the minister, Ephraim Melville, is the important character in this story. Quite often the minister would sometimes be present at confessions. We discussed William Struthers earlier, who was involved in the interrogation of Marion Muir. So sometimes the minister would be present at the interrogation, but rarely do you see a single minister taking sort of control of the operations of witch hunting and directing the Kirk session in a certain way. Even though the minister is supposed to have lots of power, they're supposed to act collectively. The minister is supposed to work in cooperation with the elders who are also on the session. So Ephraim Melville seems to have quite an interesting role. Now, in terms of it starts off probably in around December 1643. Around 16 people were accused, and out of those, about 9 were executed. And these were usually quite prominent women. Most of them were women of sort of mariners, people, who sailed on ships. There seemed to be some sort of quarrel between a couple of the mariner families, the Lowry family and the Cants. And this kind of sparked off some of the multiple accusations which the Kirk Session and Ephraim Melville seize upon to sort of steer the witch hunt further. By the summer of 1644, it kind of burnt itself out. And this is what you see with quite a lot of these chain reaction style witch hunts like Queensferry, where quite a few people are interrogated and accuse each other in short spaces of time. And the community, is obviously at this point is quite isolated and needs to come together in order to go forward. Janet Lowry, her husband, complains to the Kirk Session about what they had done to her wife. And then you find some other family members who appear before the Kirk Session, who it's really, really emotionally quite draining and tragic to read some of these stories of family members of some of the accused who have been executed. There's one father, his wife and one of his daughters are executed. They're one of these 9 accused witches who get executed. And his second daughter is actually in prison on suspicion of witchcraft. And there's a long legal process involved of trying to get his only surviving daughter, Margaret Young, free from prison in Queensferry. And they finally do release her in about September 1644. And again, that's something you don't usually find in the records, is what happens after the witch trials. The witch trials tend to be recorded, and then the Kirk Session stops and they move on to other business of the day. But it's quite insightful when you get, like, say, evidence or what's happening in the community after the witch trials themselves. Some of the family members of those who have been accused, it's quite good to get their stories.
I think that is a real missing part of history, that we kind of think that the tragedy starts and ends when people are killed, and we don't really reflect upon who had to live in the community with the burden of having a family member killed as a witch, and what that meant for them in the community, and how they dealt with their grief. Ciaran, that sounds absolutely fascinating, and we really, really hope we can persuade you to come on and give us a really in-depth, detailed story of the Witches of Queensferry when you've finished your studies.
Thanks so much for listening to the Witches of Scotland podcast. As ever, please do tell people about the campaign. Please do feel free to comment under some of the news articles that pop up on social media, if anything, just to have some voices of sanity and amongst some completely bonkers takes on the campaign. We are on lots of social media, as we always say. We're on, Claire, we're on Facebook, we're on
Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Oh, in fact, on TikTok, there's History 101 that's now following us on TikTok, and they did a wee video and linked us into it, and we got like hundreds more people viewing our video. But just to show you the size of social media, this woman that does History 101 was telling people about Witches of Scotland, and she got 23,000 views on the video, and that's just one person doing that, as opposed to our rather modest 1,000.
Listen, I'll take that 1,000. I'm happy. It's quality.
It's brilliant. No, it's brilliant. And I tell you, as well, we have people on Instagram really, really are interested in getting in contact as well. Quite a lot of people contact us through Insta. But for any immediate chat, well, not immediate, Zoe and I are on Twitter. So if you fancy chatting to us there, that's probably the easiest way of getting in contact with us.
Definitely.
We might have to make a second TikTok, Zoe, one with you in it.
I'm not doing a TikTok. I'm not 12. My children would also kill me. It's too far. You stick with the TikTok.
Your children would never know, Zoe.
I'll do a TikTok if you can get some raccoons in on the action. If you can corral some raccoons, a little gang of raccoons, I'm there.
Ladies and gents, what you've just been given an insight into is the fact that Zoe introduced me to a site which says raccoons hourly on
Yeah,
Twitter.
yeah.
It sends you a photograph of a raccoon every hour on Twitter.
Oh, they're so cute, though. They're so cute, the little burglars. I love them.
They
They're
are.
adorable. I'm sure I wouldn't if I lived in a country that actually had raccoons. They were on my roof and stuff like that. But from the distance of Scotland to Raccoon County, I love them. They're just too cute.
They can't be that bad where they come from either, because people affectionately know them as trash pandas.
Trash pandas. It probably isn't, though, if they get in your bins and they knock your bins over and everything.
Yeah.
Unless they like look up at you winningly from all your rubbish. And then you just go, oh, you're so cute, Rocky Raccoon. I love you. And then you just pick all the rubbish up and you're happy for the day.
Just to be insight.
Probably not like that.
Zoe's life, she wants to train raccoons.
I'm going to train raccoons just to sort of be cute and to burglarize. And I'm going to train ravens and crows just to hang out with me.
Can I say that I don't think we're helping our cause really by making us sound like sane adults?
Well, okay. Yes, there's an argument for that. Maybe at this point we should move on. And I should mention that if you like what we do, you can help David, who is the sound engineer, who, as you all know, was signed up for 6 episodes and is still plugging away, trying to make the stuff that we put together into an acceptable adult form. So David has got his coffee, buy him a coffee sort of vibe. Which it's a vibe, it's not a vibe, it's a thing. And we've got links for that, I think, on our various social media. But also we've got merch, our merchandise, our lovely mugs and so on. We don't make any money from that. The money that comes from that just goes to David just to offset his costs, which in no way reflects the amount of work he has to do to turn this pig's ear into a silk purse.
I can actually see him in my mind's eye getting to the bit about raccoons and just raising his eyes.
For God's sake, when is my big sister going to grow up with their silly friend? Anyway, happy raccoons to you all, and we'll see you next episode.
Cool raccoons.
That's not happening. That's saying.
It is. I love that. I've made a phrase, cool raccoons.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye.
If you'd like to learn more about the Witches of Scotland, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for our mailing list at www.witchesofscotland.com to keep updated with the campaign. On that site, you'll be able to find how to link with us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.